The road less traveled. Jack Murphy was a man of the road. With over 25 years behind the wheel of his trusted 18-wheeler, he knew the highways better than his own backyard. Every pothole, every bend, and every patch of black ice were etched in his memory. His truck, a gleaming black Freightliner named Iron Stallion, was his home more often than not, equipped with all the necessities for long hauls across America. This night was no different, or so it seemed at first. The November chill crept into the cab despite the heater working overtime. Jack's thermos, a gift from his daughter Grace, was filled with hot coffee, a lifeline during these cold, lonely nights. He glanced at the dashboard clock. 2:03 a.m., the dead of night, when the world seemed to hold its breath. The hum of the CB radio broke the silence. "Murphy, you copy? This is Smokey Bear heading southbound near marker 220, came a familiar voice. "Copy that, Smokey. All clear on my end. How's the road up your way?" Jack replied. "Cold and quiet, just like the missus when I forget her anniversary." Smokey chuckled. Jack smirked but didn't respond. His mind drifted to his own family. Grace was grown now, with kids of her own, and his wife, Linda, had long since stopped waiting up for him. Their lives were stable and full, but Jack often felt like a ghost passing through, existing more on the road than at home. The highway stretched out before him, a ribbon of asphalt bathed in the pale glow of his truck's headlights. He'd driven this route hundreds of times, a delivery of machinery parts, bound for a factory in Indianapolis. Routine, predictable. But the road had a way of surprising even the most seasoned drivers. As Jack approached mile marker 147, something unusual caught his eye. At first, it was just a faint movement in the distance, barely distinguishable in the inky darkness. He squinted, leaning forward slightly. A deer. No, too small. Maybe a stray dog. But as he closed the distance, the shape resolved into something that made his stomach twist. A child. A small figure in a thin coat, stumbling along the highway shoulder. Jack's hands instinctively tightened on the steering wheel. His mind raced. What in God's name was a child doing out here, miles from anywhere, in this freezing cold? He flicked on his hazard lights and began to slow, carefully pulling his rig to the side of the road. "Murphy to Smokey, I've got a situation here," he said into the radio, his voice tight. "Kid on the shoulder at marker 147. Stopping to investigate." "Say again, Murphy. Did you say a kid?" Smokey's disbelief crackled over the CV. "Affirmative." "Stand by," Jack replied, already unbuckling his seatbelt. He killed the engine but left the headlights on, bathing the roadside in light. Grabbing his heavy jacket from the passenger seat, he stepped out into the bitter night. The cold hit him like a slap, cutting through his clothes and making his breath visible in the air. He scanned the shoulder, his heart pounding. The child had stopped moving, standing just outside the reach of his headlights, their small frame shivering. "Hey there, kiddo," Jack called out, his voice as calm and gentle as he could manage. "You okay? I'm not gonna hurt you, just want to help." The child didn't respond but took a hesitant step back. Jack could see now that it was a little girl, no older than 6 or 7. Her dark hair was matted, and her thin coat barely covered her. Worst of all, her feet were bare, red and raw from the cold asphalt. Jack's heart clenched. This was no accident. Someone had failed this child in the worst way. "It's freezing out here, sweetheart," he said, kneeling to make himself less intimidating. "I've got a warm truck just over there. You don't have to talk to me, but at least let me get you warm." The girl's eyes darted to the truck, and back to Jack. She looked ready to bolt, but her body betrayed her. She was too cold, too exhausted. "Here," Jack said, shrugging off his jacket and laying it on the ground between them. "You can take this. No strings attached. Just pick it up when you're ready." The girl hesitated, then darted forward like a scared animal. She grabbed the jacket and wrapped it around herself, her small frame disappearing inside the thick fabric. Jack waited, giving her space. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked softly. For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Maggie." "Nice to meet you, Maggie. I'm Jack. Now, I'd really like to help you, but I need to know if you're hurt or if there's someone I should call." Maggie shook her head violently at the mention of calling someone, her eyes wide with fear. Jack frowned but didn't push. Instead, he rose slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. "All right, Maggie. Let's start with getting you warmed up. I've got a thermos of hot chocolate in the truck. How's that sound?" She hesitated again, but eventually nodded. Jack felt a small flicker of relief. Progress. He led her back to the truck, opening the passenger door and helping her climb inside. She flinched at his touch, and Jack felt another stab of anger, not at her, but at whoever had made her this way. Once she was settled, he handed her the thermos and started the engine to get the heater going. Maggie cradled the thermos like a lifeline, sipping cautiously. Jack watched her in silence, his mind racing with questions. Where had she come from? How had she ended up here, alone and freezing on a deserted highway? "Murphy to Smokey," he said into the radio after a moment. "Got the kid in the cab. She's freezing but seems okay otherwise. Gonna head to the nearest station and call this in." "Copy that, Murphy. You need backup." "Not yet. I'll keep you posted." Jack glanced at Maggie, who was staring out the window, her small face pale and drawn. She looked so fragile, so lost. He didn't know what had happened to her, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to leave her alone. As he pulled back onto the highway, Jack silently vowed to get to the bottom of this. Whatever had brought Maggie to this dark stretch of road, he would make sure she was safe and that those responsible were held accountable. Whispers in the night. The hum of the engine filled the cab as Jack guided his truck back onto the highway. Maggie sat silently in the passenger seat, her tiny frame still dwarfed by his oversized jacket. Her small hands clutched the thermos of hot chocolate, though she barely sipped from it now. Jack stole occasional glances at her, trying to piece together the story that her silence told. The road ahead stretched into the darkness, but Jack's focus was split. His thoughts raced. Why was she out here? Who was she running from? He couldn't shake the look of fear that flashed in her eyes when he mentioned calling someone. Whatever she'd been through, it was bad enough to make her choose a freezing highway over going back. The CB radio crackled to life, pulling Jack from his thoughts. "Murphy, you copy?" "Smokey here," the familiar voice called. "Copy, Smokey," Jack responded. "I'm heading toward the truck stop near mile 130. Should be there in about 20 minutes. You sure about that? This sounds bigger than one guy can handle." Jack glanced at Maggie. Her eyes were fixed on the passing trees, her expression unreadable. "I'll let you know if I need help. For now, just keep the line clear. She's scared enough as it is." "Got it. Be safe out there." Jack clicked off the radio and turned his attention back to the road. The truck stop he mentioned wasn't much. A single diner, a gas station, and a small motel. But it was a beacon in the cold, dark night. More importantly, it was familiar territory. The owners, Pete and Darling, were good people. They wouldn't ask too many questions, but they'd know who to call if Maggie needed more than he could provide. "Are you hungry, Maggie?" Jack asked, breaking the silence. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "A little," she said softly. "Good. Darling makes the best grilled cheese sandwiches you'll ever taste. How does that sound?" Maggie didn't answer right away. Finally, she murmured, "Okay." Jack's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Every word she spoke felt like a small victory, a step toward understanding what had happened. He kept his tone light, trying not to overwhelm her. "You've been out there a while, huh?" She nodded again, her gaze still fixed out the window. "Since last night," she said quietly. Jack's chest tightened. Last night, she'd been walking for hours in the freezing cold, with no shoes and barely any protection against the wind. He couldn't imagine what kind of desperation had driven her to such extremes. "That's a long time," he said gently. "You must have been really brave to keep going." She didn't respond, but he saw the faintest hint of a smile tug at the corner of her lips. Encouraged, he pressed on. "Where were you coming from, Maddie?" "Home." Her body tensed, and she shook her head quickly. "I don't want to go back," she said, her voice trembling. "Please don't make me go back." "I'm not going to make you do anything you don't want to," Jack assured her. "But I need to understand what's going on so I can help. Was someone hurting you?" Maggie's hands tightened around the thermos. "It's my uncle," she whispered after a long pause. He's mean. He yells at me. And sometimes, She trailed off, tears welling in her eyes. Jack's jaw clenched. He'd heard enough. He'd seen enough. In his years on the road, he'd encountered stories like Maggie's before, though never this close. His wife, Linda, volunteered at a local women's shelter, and she often shared the heartbreaking realities of abuse. Jack had always been grateful that his family had never experienced such horrors. Now, faced with Maggie's story, he felt a surge of protectiveness he hadn't known he was capable of. "You don't have to tell me everything right now," Jack said softly. "But I promise you, Maddie, I'll keep you safe. No one's going to hurt you again." She looked at him then, her big brown eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "Do you mean that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "With all my heart," Jack replied firmly. "That's a promise." The lights of the truck stop appeared in the distance, a welcome break in the endless stretch of highway. Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him. Here, he could at least get Maggie out of the cold and into a warm, safe space. As he pulled into the parking lot, the familiar neon sign of Pete's Diner flickered against the dark sky. A few other trucks were parked nearby, their engines idling to keep the cabs warm. Jack parked his rig near the diner entrance and turned to Maggie. "Ready to head inside?" he asked. Maggie hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the thermos. "Are there going to be a lot of people?" she asked nervously. "Just a few," Jack said. "Pete and Darlene run the place. They're good people. They'll make sure you're comfortable." She nodded reluctantly, and Jack stepped out of the truck, pulling his jacket tighter against the cold. He walked around to the passenger side and opened the door, offering Maggie his hand. She hesitated for a moment, then took it, climbing down carefully. The warmth of the diner hit them as soon as they stepped inside. The smell of frying bacon and fresh coffee filled the air, a comforting contrast to the harsh cold outside. Darlene, a stout woman with a kind face, looked up from behind the counter and smiled. "Jack Murphy, as I live and breathe," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. Her smile faltered when she noticed Maggie, who was clinging to Jack's side. "Well, now who's this little one?" "This is Maddie," Jack said, keeping his voice calm and steady. "She needs some food and a warm place to rest. Think you can help us out?" Darlene's eyes softened, and she nodded. "Of course. Come on in, sweetheart. Let's get you settled." She led them to a booth in the corner, away from the few other patrons. Maggie slid into the seat, her eyes darting around nervously. Jack sat across from her, giving her space while Darlene bustled off to prepare their food. "You're doing great, Maddie," Jack said gently. "Just take your time. No one's rushing you." A few minutes later, Darlene returned with a plate of grilled cheese sandwiches and a steaming bowl of tomato soup. Maggie hesitated at first, but the smell of the food seemed to win her over. She picked up a sandwich and took a small bite, then another. Before long, she was eating hungrily. Jack watched her, a mix of relief and anger swirling in his chest. Relief that she was safe for now. Anger that anyone could let this happen to her in the first place. "You're a good man, Jack," Darlene said softly as she refilled his coffee cup. "Not everyone would have stopped." Jack shook his head. Not stopping wasn't an option. Darlene glanced at Maggie, who was finishing her soup. "You got a plan?" she asked. First step is getting her warm and fed, Jack said. After that, I'll figure out what to do next. She doesn't want to go back, and I don't blame her. Darlene nodded, her expression grim. Well, you know Pete and I are here if you need anything. Thanks, Dar. I appreciate it. As Maggie finished her meal, Jack leaned forward slightly. Feeling a little better now? He asked. She nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. It was really good, she said softly. Good, Jack said. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years, a contact from Linda's work at the shelter. As the phone rang, he glanced at Maggie, who was watching him with wary eyes. Whatever came next, Jack knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let her face it alone. A safe place. Jack's phone call was brief but decisive. On the other end was a woman named Susan, one of Linda's colleagues at the women's shelter. Susan was calm and professional, her voice a steady presence as Jack explained the situation. She assured him they had space and resources to help Maggie, but they needed to follow the proper protocols. She needs to tell her story, Susan explained. Not to us, but to the authorities. They'll want to ensure she's safe and investigate what happened. I'll coordinate with them, but we need to handle this delicately. She's been through enough. Jack agreed, his mind already racing ahead. He glanced at Maggie, who was now quietly doodling on a napkin with a pen Darlene had handed her. The small act of normalcy tugged at his heart. She looked so small, so vulnerable, yet there was a quiet determination in the way she held herself. All right, Susan, he said into the phone. I'll bring her in. Just tell me where. Susan gave him the address of a local child advocacy center, a place equipped to handle situations like Maggie's with care and sensitivity. It wasn't far, just another 30 miles up the highway. Bring her straight there, Susan instructed. We'll have a counselor ready to meet her. And Jack, thank you for stopping. You might have just saved her life. Jack hung up, slipping his phone back into his pocket. He took a deep breath and turned back to Maggie. She looked up at him, her big brown eyes questioning. Who are you talking to? She asked softly. Jack pulled his chair closer to the table, lowering his voice to match hers. Her name's Susan, he said gently. She works at a place where kids can go to be safe. They'd got warm beds, food, and people who care. She's going to help us figure out what to do next. Maggie's expression darkened. Will there be police? She asked, her voice trembling. Jack hesitated. He didn't want to lie to her, but he also didn't want to scare her. Maybe, he admitted, but not the kind of police you're thinking about. These are people who want to help, not hurt. They'll listen to you and make sure you're safe. Maggie looked down at her napkin, her fingers tightening around the pen. I don't like the police, she said quietly. My uncle says they'll take me away and lock me up if I tell. Jack's heart ached at her words. He leaned forward, his voice firm but kind. Maggie, I promise you, no one's taking you away. Not Susan, not the police, not anyone. You're the one in charge here. All they want is to help. She looked up at him, her expression uncertain. You'll stay with me. Jack nodded without hesitation. Every step of the way. As they left the diner, the night seemed even colder than before. Jack helped Maggie climb back into the truck, making sure she was bundled in his jacket before starting the engine. The warmth of the cab quickly enveloped them, and the familiar hum of the road returned as they merged back onto the highway. Maggie was quiet for the first few miles, staring out the window at the endless stretch of trees and darkness. Jack let her have her silence, giving her time to process. But as they neared the next town, she spoke again. Mr. Jack, she said hesitantly. Yeah, sweetheart. What if they don't believe me? Her voice was small, but the fear behind her words was immense. Jack glanced at her, his brow furrowing. Why wouldn't they believe you? She shrugged, her gaze fixed on her lap. Uncle Charlie says I make things up. He tells Mom I'm just trying to get him in trouble. Jack felt a surge of anger, but he kept his voice calm. Maggie, People like your uncle say those things because they're scared. They don't want anyone to find out what they're doing. But you're brave for telling the truth. That's what matters." She didn't respond, but Jack could see the wheels turning in her head. He let her sit with her thoughts as they approached the town limits. The faint glow of streetlights appeared on the horizon, a welcome break from the oppressive darkness of the highway. The Child Advocacy Center was a modest building tucked behind a row of trees. Its warm, inviting exterior stood in stark contrast to the cold night. Jack pulled into the parking lot and cut the engine, sitting quietly for a moment before turning to Maggie. "We're here," he said gently. "Ready to head inside?" Maggie hesitated, her small hands gripping the edges of the jacket she wore. "What if my uncle finds me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jack reached over and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "He won't. You're safe here. I promise." She nodded reluctantly, and Jack climbed out of the truck, walking around to help her down. Together, they approached the building, the soft glow of its porch light guiding their way. Before they reached the door, it opened, and a woman stepped out. "Jack?" she asked, her voice warm and welcoming. "That's me," Jack replied. "This is Maggie." The woman knelt to Maggie's level, offering a kind smile. "Hi, Maggie. My name's Sarah. I work here at the center. It's so nice to meet you." Maggie glanced at Jack, seeking reassurance. He nodded, and she turned back to Sarah, offering a small, hesitant smile in return. "Why don't we go inside where it's warm?" Sarah suggested. "We've got hot cocoa and some really comfy chairs." Maggie looked at Jack again. "You'll come too, right?" "Of course," Jack said, his voice firm. "I'm not going anywhere." Inside the center, the atmosphere was calm and inviting. The walls were painted in soft, soothing colors, and the air smelled faintly of vanilla. A small table in the corner held coloring books and crayons, and a couch piled with plush pillows sat near a window. Sarah led them to a private room, where Maggie could sit and talk in comfort. Jack stayed close, his presence a constant reassurance. As Sarah gently guided Maggie through her story, Jack's heart broke all over again. The details she shared were harrowing: shouts, threats, and worse. And yet, through it all, Maggie showed a resilience that amazed him. When she finished, Sarah thanked her for her bravery and promised that they would do everything they could to keep her safe. "You're not alone anymore, Maggie," she said. "We're here for you." Maggie nodded, her eyes shining with tears, but there was a hint of relief in her expression. While Sarah stepped out to make some calls, Jack sat with Maggie on the couch. She leaned against him, exhausted but finally at ease. "Thank you, Mr. Jack," she said softly. Jack put an arm around her shoulders, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to thank me, sweetheart. I'm just glad I was there when you needed someone." As the first rays of dawn began to peek through the window, Jack knew that this was only the beginning of Maggie's journey. But for the first time, the road ahead didn't seem so daunting. Together, they'd found a way forward, a path to safety, healing, and hope. The road to justice. The first rays of dawn began creeping over the horizon as Jack sat quietly in the advocacy center's waiting area. The room was still, except for the occasional shuffle of papers or the murmur of voices from the offices beyond. Maggie was in a private room with Sarah, where a trained counselor was helping her feel safe enough to share more of her story. Jack had insisted on staying nearby, and though exhausted, he didn't dare close his eyes. His presence had become a source of comfort for Maggie, and he wasn't about to let her down. Susan, the woman Jack had spoken to on the phone earlier, appeared in the doorway, her expression calm but purposeful. She carried a notepad and a steaming mug of coffee, which she handed to Jack before sitting beside him. "How's Maggie doing?" Jack asked immediately. Susan gave him a reassuring smile. "She's doing better than I expected. For a child who's been through so much, she's remarkably strong." Sarah said Maggie opened up about some of the things that have been happening at home. "It's clear she's been through severe emotional and physical abuse, but she's also incredibly brave." Jack nodded, his jaw tightening as he processed the weight of those words. "What happens now?" Susan flipped open her notepad. "First, we've contacted a special division of the local police who handle cases like this. They're trained to work with children in a trauma-informed way, so Maggie won't have to relive everything more than necessary. An officer and a detective will be here shortly to take her statement." Jack frowned slightly. Do they really need to talk to her now? She's been through enough. "I know," Susan said softly. "But the sooner we get her statement, the sooner we can start building a case against her uncle. If we wait too long, it might give him time to cover his tracks or make excuses. We have to act quickly, Jack. This is about protecting Maggie and holding him accountable." Jack sighed, nodding reluctantly. He knew Susan was right, but it didn't make the process any easier to stomach. About an hour later, the officers arrived, a woman named Detective Ramirez and a younger officer named Blake. Ramirez had a warm maternal demeanor, and she immediately put Jack at ease. She sat down with Sarah and Maggie in the private room, ensuring the environment remained as calm and non-threatening as possible. Jack stayed outside, pacing the hallway as he waited. Every now and then, he glanced through the small window in the door, watching as Maggie spoke hesitantly to Ramirez. The detective's patience and gentle tone seemed to help, but it was clear Maggie was still scared. "Jack," Susan said, appearing at his side, "you've done so much for Maggie already, but I have to ask, would you be willing to give a statement as well? The fact that you found her, that you stopped and brought her here, will be critical for the investigation." "Of course," Jack said without hesitation. "Anything that helps." Susan led him to another room where Officer Blake was waiting with a notepad and a small recording device. Jack recounted the events of the night in meticulous detail, how he'd spotted Maggie on the shoulder of the highway, how she'd been barefoot and freezing, and how she'd begged him not to take her back. The officer listened intently, asking a few clarifying questions, but otherwise letting Jack tell the story uninterrupted. When he finished, Officer Blake leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. "You did the right thing, Jack. Most people would have driven right past her, but you stopped. That might have saved her life." Jack shrugged, his voice quiet but firm. "Stopping wasn't a choice, not when I saw her out there. She needed someone, and I just happened to be the guy driving by." By mid-morning, Maggie's interview was complete, and Detective Ramirez joined Jack in the waiting area. She looked both determined and grim. "We've got enough to open an investigation," Ramirez said. "Between Maggie's statement, the visible bruises, and what you witnessed, there's more than enough probable cause to arrest her uncle. A warrant's already being issued." Jack's shoulders sagged slightly with relief, but he still felt a knot of tension in his chest. "What about Maggie? Is she staying here?" "For now," Susan interjected. "The center has a secure facility where she can stay until we find a more permanent arrangement. We've also contacted her mother." Jack's eyes narrowed. "Her mother? What do we know about her?" "Maggie said her mom didn't protect her." Susan hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "It's complicated. From what Maggie shared, her mother works long hours and may not have been fully aware of what was happening. That doesn't excuse her, of course, but we'll need to speak with her directly before making any decisions about custody." Jack frowned, but didn't argue. He'd heard enough stories from his wife Linda to know that abuse often thrived in situations where one parent was absent or unwilling to see the truth. Still, he felt fiercely protective of Maggie and didn't want her going back into a dangerous environment. Later that afternoon, Susan asked Jack to sit down with Maggie before he left. The thought of leaving weighed heavily on him, but he knew his part in this was almost over. The professionals would take it from here. Jack found Maggie in the playroom, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a box of crayons and a stack of paper. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting up with a smile. "Hi, Mr. Jack," she said softly. "Hey, kiddo," he replied, sitting down beside her. "What are you working on?" She held up a drawing of a big black truck under a starry sky. "It's your truck," she said proudly. "The one you picked me up in." Jack chuckled, his chest tightening with emotion. "That's pretty good. You're a great artist." Maggie smiled shyly, then looked down at her paper. "Are you leaving now?" she asked. Jack hesitated. "Yeah, sweetheart. I've got to get back on the road. But you're in good hands here. Susan and Sarah are going to take great care of you." Maggie's smile faltered, and she fiddled with her crayon. "Will I ever see you again?" Jack felt a lump rise in his throat. He reached out and gently squeezed her shoulder. "I don't know, Maggie, but I promise you this, no matter where you are or what happens, you'll always have people who care about you. You're not alone anymore." She nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "Thank you for stopping," she whispered. Jack stood, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. "You don't have to thank me, Maggie. Just keep being brave, okay?" She nodded again, and Jack forced himself to turn away before his emotions got the better of him. As he walked back to his truck, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would stay with him forever. As Jack pulled back onto the highway, the sun was high in the sky, and the world seemed brighter than it had the night before. He didn't know what the future held for Maggie, but he took comfort in knowing she was finally safe. Still, he couldn't shake the thought that his job wasn't entirely done. Maggie had changed something in him, awakened a sense of responsibility he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't just a truck driver anymore. He was a man who'd stopped when it mattered, and that choice had made all the difference. The miles stretched out before him, but this time, the road didn't feel so lonely. Somewhere out there, Maggie was beginning a new chapter, and Jack knew he'd carry her story with him wherever he went. The ripple effect. The highway stretched ahead, endless and unwavering, as Jack guided his truck through the gentle curves of the Midwest countryside. The rhythmic hum of the engine usually gave him solace, but today his mind was a storm. The thought of Maggie, alone in the advocacy center, tugged at him. She was in good hands, he told himself, but the memories of her bruised face, the haunted look in her eyes, and her small, sockless feet trudging along the highway refused to fade. He had seen hard things on the road before, wrecks, breakdowns, even desperate hitchhikers. But nothing like this. The idea of a child so young and vulnerable being thrust into such a nightmare shook him to his core. He gripped the wheel tighter. This wasn't something he could just move on from. That evening, Jack pulled into a familiar truck stop, the same one where Maggie had eaten her grilled cheese. Darlene was still behind the counter, her warm smile faltering slightly when she saw him walk in alone. "Jack," she called out, "everything okay? What happened with the little girl?" He took a seat at the counter, rubbing his hands over his face before answering. "She's safe now, at a center for kids like her. The police are handling the rest." Darlene placed a steaming cup of coffee in front of him, her eyes filled with concern. "Poor thing. I can't stop thinking about her. How does something like that happen? And what kind of person could hurt a child?" Jack shook his head, his voice low. "The kind who doesn't deserve to walk free. They're going after her uncle, but it's going to take time. Maggie, she's tough, but no kid should have to be that tough." Darlene nodded, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder. "Well, you did right by her, Jack. Not many would have stopped. You probably saved her life." Jack didn't respond immediately. Instead, he sipped his coffee, his mind drifting. After a long pause, he said, "I can't just stop with Maggie. There are more kids out there, more people who need help. I've been driving these roads for 25 years, and I've probably passed by more trouble than I'll ever know. Maybe it's time I started paying more attention." The next morning, Jack made a call to his wife, Linda. She was his rock, the steady force that kept him grounded during his years on the road. He needed her advice now more than ever. "Jack," Linda said, her voice warm and familiar, "I was wondering when you'd call. I've been worried. You sound tired." "I am," Jack admitted, "but it's not the miles wearing me down this time. It's what happened last night." He recounted everything, finding Maggie, taking her to the diner, and finally leaving her at the advocacy center. Linda listened intently, her silence a testament to how seriously she took his words. "She's just a kid, Linda," Jack said, his voice heavy with emotion. "She didn't deserve any of what happened to her, and now I'm wondering how many other kids are out there, walking the same roads, waiting for someone to notice." Linda's response was immediate. "Then let's do something about it." "What do you mean?" Jack asked, surprised. "You're in a unique position, Jack," she said. "You and other truckers, you see things most people never do. You're out there every day, covering hundreds of miles. If you're willing, you could be the eyes and ears for people like Maggie." Jack thought about her words. It wasn't the first time Linda had inspired him to take action, but this felt bigger than anything he'd taken on before. "How?" he asked. "Where do I even start?" "Let me reach out to some contacts at the shelter," Linda said. "We can put together a program. Train truckers to recognize the signs of abuse or trafficking. If enough of you get involved, you could make a real difference." Within a week, Linda had connected Jack with a national advocacy group that worked to combat human trafficking and child exploitation. They were enthusiastic about the idea, offering resources and guidance on how to train drivers to spot signs of trouble. Jack, in turn, reached out to his network of fellow truckers, starting with Smokey, Tommy Chun, and a handful of others he trusted implicitly. "What you're talking about is a game changer, Murph," Smokey said during a call one evening. "Count me in. Heck, I've seen some shady stuff out there myself, but I didn't know what to do about it. If we can make a difference, I'm all for it." Word spread quickly. Within a month, Jack and Linda had organized the first training session at a local truck stop. The turnout exceeded their expectations. Nearly 50 drivers showed up, eager to learn. Representatives from the advocacy group walked them through everything, from identifying suspicious behavior to safely reporting it without putting themselves or others in danger. "This isn't about playing hero," one of the trainers explained. "It's about being vigilant and knowing how to act when something feels wrong. Sometimes, a phone call is all it takes to save a life." As the program grew, so did Jack's sense of purpose. The initiative, which they named Highway Guardians, quickly gained traction across the Midwest. More truck stops hosted training sessions, and dispatch centers began incorporating the program into their safety briefings. Jack even convinced his company to distribute informational flyers to all their drivers, complete with hotline numbers and tips for recognizing signs of trouble. Through it all, Maggie remained in Jack's thoughts. He checked in with Susan regularly, asking for updates on her case. Maggie was thriving, Susan told him. She was attending school, receiving counseling, and living in a safe foster home while the courts decided her future. Her uncle had been arrested and was facing multiple charges, thanks in large part to Maggie's bravery and Jack's intervention. One evening, months after that fateful night on the highway, Jack received a letter at his home. The envelope was addressed in careful, childlike handwriting. Inside was a simple drawing of a big black truck under a bright blue sky. Next to it were the words, "Thank you, Mr. Jack. You're my hero. Love, Maggie." Jack stared at the drawing for a long time, his throat tight. It wasn't just a thank you. It was a reminder of why he'd started this journey, and why he couldn't stop. He framed the drawing and hung it in the cab of his truck, right next to the photo of his family. Every time he looked at it, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The highways were vast, and the problems they faced were daunting. But Jack knew one thing for certain. Every life saved was worth the miles. And out there, under the endless sky, Jack Murphy drove on, his eyes open, his heart steadfast, and his mission clear. Sometimes, he thought, the road wasn't just a place for moving goods. Sometimes it was a path to hope, safety, and redemption. The letter from Maggie lingered in Jack's thoughts long after he tucked it into the frame. Her simple words, "You're my hero," carried a weight Jack wasn't sure he deserved, But he knew one thing for certain. Her gratitude wasn't just for him. It was for every driver, every advocate, and every stranger who chose to step in when the world turned its back. Linda's network continued to grow, with truckers from across the Midwest signing up for the Highway Guardians training. Each session brought new faces, men and women from every walk of life, all united by a shared purpose. For many, the stories Jack shared about Maggie were a wake-up call, a reminder that even in the vast isolation of the open road, their actions mattered. One particular story stuck with Jack, shared during a training session at a truck stop near Des Moines. A driver named Earl stood up, his voice trembling as he recounted an incident from years earlier. "I was parked at a rest area late one night," Earl began, his hands fidgeting with his cap. "Saw a girl, maybe 15, standing near a car with some guy. Didn't think much of it at first, but something about her didn't sit right. She wasn't dressed for the weather, and she kept looking around like she was scared." Earl paused, his voice thick with regret. "I didn't do anything. Figured it wasn't my business. But the next day, I saw her face on the news. She was missing. Never found out what happened to her." The room fell silent. Earl looked at Jack, his eyes glistening. "If I'd had this training back then, maybe I could have helped her. Maybe she'd be home right now." Jack put a hand on Earl's shoulder. "You can't change the past," he said gently. "But you're here now. And that means the next time you see something, you'll know what to do." The ripple effect of Highway Guardians began to spread beyond the trucking community. Local law enforcement agencies reached out, eager to collaborate with the growing network of vigilant drivers. Advocacy centers across the region reported an uptick in tips and successful rescues, many initiated by truckers who'd undergone the training. One of the most significant moments came when Jack was invited to speak at a national trucking convention in Chicago. Standing on a stage in front of thousands of drivers, Jack felt a wave of nervous energy. Public speaking wasn't his forte, but this wasn't about him. It was about Maggie, Earl's story, and the countless others who had been overlooked or forgotten. "I've been driving these highways for over 25 years, Jack began, his voice steady despite the enormity of the audience. "And I'll admit, I used to think my job was just about getting cargo from point A to point B. But then one night, I saw a little girl walking on the side of the road. She was freezing, barefoot, and scared out of her mind. I stopped because I couldn't not stop. That girl, Maggie, changed my life." He paused, scanning the crowd. "What I've learned since that night is that every one of us has the power to make a difference. It doesn't matter if you're driving a rig, working in dispatch, or serving coffee at a truck stop. If you see something that doesn't feel right, speak up. Call someone. Be the person who stops." The applause that followed was thunderous, and Jack felt a swell of hope. These weren't just words to this crowd. They were a call to action. Months turned into a year, and Highway Guardians became a recognized initiative across the trucking industry. Dispatch centers implemented new protocols. Truck stops displayed posters with hotline numbers, and drivers began sharing stories of lives they'd touched through their vigilance. Jack's connection to Maggie remained strong. Though he didn't see her often, he received occasional updates from Susan and Linda. Maggie was thriving in her foster home, excelling in school, and even taking art classes. Her resilience amazed Jack, and he took quiet pride in knowing he played a small part in her journey. One day, while parked at a rest area, Jack received a video message from Maggie. She appeared on the screen, holding up a new drawing. This one depicted a group of trucks surrounding a small figure on a dark road, their headlights forming a circle of light. "Hi, Mr. Jack," Maggie said, her voice bright. "I just wanted to say thank you again. My counselor says it's good to talk about what happened, so I told my class about you and how you stopped to help me. My teacher said it was really brave, but I think you're the brave one." She paused, her smile widening. "Guess what? I'm going to help other kids now, too. There's this group at my school for kids who've had hard times, and I'm going to share my story with them. My counselor says helping others can make us stronger. The video ended with Maggie's drawing filling the screen, her small hand waving goodbye. Jack sat in his cab, the video playing on a loop. The highways felt different now, not just routes for delivering goods, but a lifeline for those who might otherwise go unnoticed. Later that evening, as Jack pulled into a familiar stretch of highway near mile marker 147, he slowed his truck, glancing toward the shoulder where he'd first seen Maggie. The memory was vivid. Her small, shivering frame in the icy wind, the desperation in her eyes. He smiled to himself, gripping the wheel tighter. Somewhere out there, Maggie was walking the new path, one filled with light and hope. And Jack, he'd keep driving, keep watching, and keep stopping when it mattered. Because sometimes, the smallest acts, like pulling over on a dark highway, had the power to change everything. Bridging the divide. A year after that fateful November night, the landscape of Jack Murphy's life had transformed. The Highway Guardians Initiative was no longer a small regional effort. It had grown into a nationwide network, connecting truckers, advocacy centers, law enforcement, and social workers. The program's success wasn't just measured in lives saved, but in the countless stories of drivers stepping up to make a difference. Jack, however, remained humble about his role. Every time someone thanked him, he simply pointed to Maggie's courage. "She's the real hero," he'd say. "I just gave her a ride." One crisp autumn morning, Jack parked his Freightliner at a bustling truck stop near Springfield, Missouri. He had been invited to a regional meeting of Highway Guardians volunteers, and as he stepped inside the large event hall, he was greeted with warm applause. Faces from across the trucking industry, men and women of all ages, turned toward him with gratitude and admiration. Darling was there, of course, managing the coffee station and offering her trademark warmth. Smokey had made the trip too, proudly wearing his Highway Guardians patch on his jacket. Earl, the driver who had shared his story of regret, was now one of the most active recruiters for the initiative. Jack spent the first half of the meeting listening to updates and success stories. A driver in Texas had spotted a distressed teenager at a rest area and called local authorities, leading to the dismantling of a trafficking ring. Another in Nebraska had flagged a suspicious vehicle, resulting in the safe rescue of 2 missing children. When it was Jack's turn to speak, he stood before the group, his rough hands gripping the edges of the podium. "I'm proud of all of you," he began. "Every single one of you who's taken the time to train, to watch, to care. The road can be a lonely place, but you've turned it into something more, something that connects us to the people who need us most." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "When I stopped for Maggie that night, I didn't know what I was walking into. I didn't know if it would be a scam, a trap, or worse. But I knew this. I couldn't live with myself if I just drove past her. And now, because of that little girl, I've seen the best this community has to offer. You've proven that we're more than drivers, we're guardians." The crowd erupted into applause, and Jack stepped back, feeling a mixture of pride and humility. He wasn't a man who sought the spotlight, but moments like this reminded him why he'd kept pushing forward. As the event wrapped up, Jack found himself standing outside, looking out at the rows of trucks lined up in the lot. The cool breeze carried the faint smell of diesel and autumn leaves. Smokey joined him, leaning against a nearby post. "You know, Murph," Smokey said, lighting a cigarette, "you've done something real special here. Never thought I'd see truckers turning into heroes, but you made it happen." Jack chuckled softly. "Wasn't just me, Smokey. Took a lot of people to make this work." "Maybe," Smokey said, exhaling a puff of smoke. "But it started with you stopping for that kid. You ever hear from her anymore?" Jack nodded. "Yeah, she's doing great. She's living with a foster family now. Good people. And she started sharing her story to help other kids. Makes me proud." Smokey grinned. "She's a chip off the old block." Jack laughed, shaking his head. "Let's not go that far." A few weeks later, Jack received a call from Linda. Her voice held a hint of excitement as she explained that Maggie had asked if Jack could attend her school's upcoming Community Heroes event. She was giving a presentation about her journey, and she wanted him to be there. Jack hesitated. The idea of being in a school gymnasium, surrounded by parents and kids, wasn't exactly his comfort zone. But when Linda said, "She wants to thank you in person," he didn't have the heart to say no. The day of the event arrived, and Jack found himself in the auditorium of Maggie's school. The space buzzed with energy as families and students filled the rows of folding chairs. Jack felt out of place in his plaid shirt and worn boots, but Linda reassured him with a gentle squeeze of his hand. When Maggie took the stage, Jack barely recognized her. She stood tall and confident, her dark hair neatly braided, and her eyes bright with determination. She held a microphone with steady hands, her voice clear as she began to speak. "A year ago, I didn't know if I would ever feel safe again," she began. "I thought no one would care if I disappeared. But someone did care. His name is Jack Murphy." The audience turned toward Jack, and he felt his cheeks flush. Maggie continued, recounting how Jack had found her on the highway, taken her to safety, and stayed by her side when she was scared. "Mr. Jack didn't just save me," she said. "He gave me a chance to believe in people again. And because of him, I want to help others too." She held up a small plaque and turned to Jack. "Mr. Jack, this is for you. It says, 'Thank you for being my guardian angel.'" The room erupted in applause as Maggie walked down from the stage and handed Jack the plaque. He knelt to her level, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't need to do this, Maggie," he said softly. "But thank you. I'll treasure this forever." As the event ended and families filtered out, Maggie introduced Jack to her foster parents, a kind couple named Dan and Teresa. They spoke warmly about how Maggie had blossomed in their care, her love of art, and her determination to make a difference. "We can't thank you enough for what you did," Teresa said. "Maggie talks about you all the time. You're her hero." Jack shook his head. "She's the hero. I just gave her a ride." Driving home that night, Jack thought about how far Maggie had come, and how far he had too. The highways stretched ahead, as endless as ever, but they felt different now. Every mile was a reminder of the lives he and the highway guardians had touched. As he glanced at the plaque Maggie had given him, now propped up on his dashboard, Jack felt a quiet sense of purpose settle over him. He wasn't just hauling cargo anymore. He was hauling hope, 1 mile at a time.